leaders travel to Washington for the annual World Bank IMF meetings. Former Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland takes us behind the scenes of what's on the agenda. And China has put the supply of critical minerals on everyone's agenda, threatening to cut off supplies that it pretty much monopolizes. Is there a way around the chokehold? But we start with the war in Iran and the ceasefire announced this week with negotiations taking place in Pakistan led by Vice President Vance. Ambassador Richard Haas served as a diplomat in both Republican and Democratic administrations before leading the Council on Foreign Relations for 2 decades. He now is with Centerview Partners. Well, Richard, you have been in the room, as it were, for some very high-level negotiations. Give us a guide to how we should look at the negotiations going on right now involving the war in Iran.
Well, the beginning of negotiations tends to be throat clearing, in my experience, that people are often posturing, getting comfortable. The fact that, in particular, the U.S. side is so inexperienced. You've got 2 non-diplomats who have been the principal diplomats for the United States, and then you've got the vice president who doesn't have a long background. Plus, David, the 2 sides, shall we say, to say they're far apart would be a diplomatic understatement. They are, someone pointed out, it's wider than the Strait of Hormuz, the differences between the 2 sides. And the question is, to what extent are they willing and able, are they prepared essentially to begin to bridge the differences? So this is a tall order, plus one more thing. It's taking place against the backdrop, shall we say, of something other than a ceasefire. This is already a messy situation. It's not war, but it's not peace or even a pause. It's something in between, which again complicates the task.
As a diplomat, how do you start breaking down that gap, as you described it? I mean, people have said in a Venn diagram, there's no overlap right now in the position of the 2 sides.
Well, the first thing is, before you start thinking about what you're going to try to accomplish across the table, you need to have in your own mind, say, let's talk about the U.S. side. What are its priorities? You've got the nuclear issue, you've got the Strait, you've got ceasefire, you've got Iranian support for proxies, you've got Iranian drone and ballistic missile development, you've got internal Iranian treatment of its own people. It's a long list. So one thing is to think about, what are our priorities? Where also are our opportunities? Where do we think potentially there's some give on the other side, or the gap between the 2 sides is not going to be the same in each one of the things I just mentioned. It might be bigger in some of the others. Where are we prepared to compromise?
What does the United States have to come out of this with in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, which wasn't even an issue going in?
Yeah, I think the 2 biggest issues are the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear. The Strait of Hormuz is the more time-urgent issue because every day that goes by is disastrous for the international economy and for the region. The nuclear issue can be parked for a while, not because it's not important, but unless there's evidence that Iran is changing the status of nuclear materials or its program, then nothing changes. So I would say Strait of Hormuz is the big issue. What we cannot allow is for Iran to exercise sole control over the Strait, charging tolls where it derives all the revenues, because that would also eliminate any economic pressure on the Iranian regime. What I've argued is we ought to adopt the principle that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be open for all or closed to all, including Iran. And what I've recommended with two of my colleagues, Neil Ferguson and Phil Zelikow, is that we create a new Strait of Hormuz commission or authority that would essentially govern the operation of the Strait. Perhaps you could have a fee charge, but then it would be distributed, not just to Iran, but to the other, half dozen or so local countries. Might be some degree of enforcement or support from the countries in Europe and Asia that are most dependent on the passage through the Strait. I would bring China into the equation because it has influence, obviously, in Trump. But we need some type of a governing authority that dilutes Iran's ability to decide who gets to use the Strait. And if we can't get that, David, I would favor a blockade. Again, open for all or closed to all, including Iran, and a blockade option in the Gulf of Oman.
Even if you get to a governing authority that we all agree to, it sounds like Iran's going to have a say. They're going to have a seat at the table. It's not clear they had that before. Is that really a step backward? Because it used to be an international waterway.
You're right. And there's no return, though, to the status quo ante. I think Iran has discovered that it has more leverage than it ever quite realized before. I don't think we can walk this back. we're gonna have to bring them in. So yeah, we're gonna end up here and elsewhere, probably worse off than we were 5, 6 weeks ago. What we want to do, though, is limit the scale of that. And I think, again, probably the wisest course here is not to do something to Iran, but to do something with Iran, to give Iran a stake in an open Strait of Hormuz. And I think we have a chance to achieve that, but probably only if we have the pressure of saying, you either agree to something reasonable, and again, try to get the Chinese and others to help us here, or we're going to make it impossible for you to benefit from the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that gives us a little bit of leverage. Also, Iran's economy is really hurting, David. Iran was in terrible shape before this war. It's in worse shape now. So yes, they have some leverage, obviously, given some of the things they've done, but I think we would be wrong to ignore the degree to which we also enjoy a degree of leverage here.
Well, I wonder about the leverage going into this, because looking at what the military has done in Iran, you'd say, boy, the United States has an awful lot of leverage, with Israel as well. Is it the case that the United States has the upper hand going into this, or is the mere fact that Iran has survived and can still do damage despite all we've done, does actually give leverage to Iran?
Iran emerges from this with considerable leverage. It's so interesting that you can, quote unquote, win a war in the classic battlefield sense, but lose a war in the political leverage strategic sense. And that's what I would argue has happened here. The United States and Israel, by normal measures of warfare, have done extremely well. But strategically, politically, Iran has emerged with far more leverage than it had before.
We in the United States have a tendency to look at it as United States versus Iran. There is another player. As you pointed out in your newsletter, Home and Away, you pointed out Israel has been a significant factor, including perhaps in getting the war started in the first place. How do you deal with that as a diplomat when you've got Bibi Netanyahu and Israel having a say?
I think now, David, we probably have to accept the awkward reality that American and Israeli interests here are diverging. What Israel's been doing in Lebanon recently, I would argue, is not necessary. Certainly not a priority for us at this point. So I'll be blunt. President, there's this thing called the telephone. President ought to pick it up. Get on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu and say stop. The argument for continuing the war is not nearly as strong as the argument for a ceasefire and these peace talks. Your vital national interests are not at stake. Iran is not doing anything new, say with its nuclear program, that would pose an existential threat to you. What you're doing in Lebanon is discretionary, not essential. Knock it off. And I think that's important. And I worry, David. I think actually one of the losers in this war is the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And this was a relationship already under pressure because of what had happened in Gaza over the last few years. And I worry that by overreaching here, the Israeli government may have contributed to a further deterioration in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which I would argue is in the interest of neither country.
Your role at Centerview Partners now has you consulting with large corporations, with CEOs, about business and economics. What does it mean for them? What are you advising them of what this means over the longer term?
I'd say two things. I have a long list, but let me highlight two things. One is it's a little bit difficult to see how this part of the world rebounds completely. There was the business model of the Gulf, of the, if you will, Dubai. Let's use that as a shorthand. Tax havens, stability, great economic opportunity, energy, data centers. A little bit hard now to imagine the same scale of investment. If I told you your multi-billion-dollar investment would require 10 years of stability to pay off, you might think twice before opening up your checkbook to do that. That's one thing. I think people have to think a little bit differently. Second of all, rethink the whole notion of economic and energy security. Much more diversification, less emphasis on one geography, less emphasis on one form of energy, and so forth. I think corporations in this country and the rest of the world have to assume that the sort of thing we just saw here is not a one-off. It's not something that couldn't happen again here or in other parts of the world.
And finally, what are the chances of a true resolution of this situation, which was going on for almost 50 years now, as opposed to sort of monitoring and managing a chronic problem where we're going back and forth over years?
At the risk of depressing your viewers even further, David, I don't think you get a resolution absent a fundamental change in the political system in Iran, and unfortunately I don't see that in the cards anytime soon. Maybe down the road against the backdrop of further economic problems. But right now, this regime is, if anything, more entrenched than it was 5, 6 weeks ago. So then you say, okay, we're not going to solve the problem. we're managing it. So we come up with some mechanism maybe to manage passage through the Strait of Hormuz, not perfect. Maybe we come up with some negotiated or non-negotiated, maybe just red lines and implicit signals about how we put a ceiling on Iran's nuclear program. I don't know about their support for proxies. They're going to continue to build drones. Every basement is a would-be factory when it comes to drones. Look what Ukraine has done. So I think your word management is the right word. You know, too many people look at things as problems to be solved. Let me just suggest, if we're lucky, this is a situation, this is a condition that we will be able to manage.
Up next, Afsani Beshlos of Rock Creek on some of the unintended consequences of the war in Iran. The war in Iran has shaken the Gulf region, cost lives and billions of dollars, and roiled financial markets. Afsani Beshlos of Rock Creek knows the region and its importance like few others, having grown up in Tehran before leaving ahead of the Islamic Republic's rise to power. We spoke with her before the U.S. and Iran agreed to a ceasefire and asked about some of the second-order effects of the conflict on the global economy.
Depending on which way it goes, David, it could be, if oil prices stay up, or the global economy will be in a much lower growth rate, a higher inflation, interest rates would hike. Kevin Warsh was selected by the president to reduce interest rates in the U.S. His first act, even if it's not to, reduce, certainly may be to keep it neutral, or there might be a scenario of a hike, which is the opposite of what we would have thought a few months ago. So there's a lot of repercussions in the U.S. The biggest repercussion is obviously outside the U.S. in the oil importing countries, because oil prices, even if they go, you get away from this 100 to 150, it's not just a question of prices, but it's a question of supply. What we've seen the last few weeks, where a lot of people are rationing, particularly lower income countries, are rationing to even cook food or to run their cooling and heating, whatever their energy needs are. That could be a huge impact on those countries. So that's, again, my sort of negative scenario. The positive is, we go back. The big question is, if there's not regime change in Iran, it may not be such a big deal for the rest of the world, but it will be very sad, because if this regime stays on, they will continue to terrorize the Iranians who are living there, as they did kill 40,000 people in January and really got away with it. So in that scenario, I think they will be more belligerent altogether, and that would be worrisome.
When you talk about oil importing countries, perhaps the two largest are China and India.
Yes.
What does this mean for China? Because China has had fairly friendly relations with Iran.
Yes, and that's a really big question, because I think close to 30% of China's energy, a very large share of India's energy, come from the Strait, from Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, etc., and some of the natural gas. So they've definitely been hugely impacted. Also, we keep on talking about energy intensity in the US has gone down, where we're still buying and using the same goods. Our energy intensity has gone down because we're more services, we're more financial services, etc., technology. But the goods that we're buying from China, India, and the rest of the world are still very energy intensive, and they are getting hit very badly right now. Now, China, as you know, has been diversifying its sources of energy very rapidly through doing more in power, from the car industry, which has become much more concentrated on EVs compared to the rest of the world. They are diversifying into nuclear. They can build nuclear power plants in a couple of years. It takes us 10 years to do it. It takes them maybe 2-3 years. So there's the longer term and the shorter term. In the short term, they're certainly currently impacted, and they will continue to get impacted. The big question, David, is whether there's a scenario under which we have ships that are under Chinese protection or Indian protection or Russian protection coming in somehow into the Strait and being safe compared to American or European aligned tankers. So that is the big question. That has not really sort of been a thing in the last few weeks, but it will be something to watch out for.
What does this mean for the rest of the world? When we focus on the big players, we focus on the Middle East and the U.S. But what does this mean for Africa? What does this mean for the rest of Asia, some of the developing countries?
So again, if you're a big Asian country right now, if you're a Japan, or again, even, China, the biggest countries, Korea, you can buy energy at spot prices. You can afford to still import energy as we speak. You're paying a lot for it, but you're able to afford it. If you are a poor country like the Philippines or Bangladesh, you have two problems. One is that you can't afford to buy at spot price, so you're going to suffer. And two, it's not even a question of just price, it's a question of supply to you, because the US and other people who are selling will prefer to sell to the bigger, richer, versus the lower income countries, so they will get hit again. So together with all the other forces going on in the economy, between what's happening with AI, what's happening with this war, you could be, what's happening with climate and the parts of Africa that are running out of water, you're going to have potentially very major problems, particularly for Europe when it comes to immigration.
As profound as the effects of the war are on the rest of the world, nowhere is it felt more, or more immediately, than in the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Before the ceasefire was agreed to, Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations told us that the critical importance of the Strait of Hormuz was not lost on those closest to it.
Anybody who was looking at this situation and was concerned about the outbreak of hostilities between the United States and Iran, or Iran and anybody, had to be concerned about freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, despite the fact that the major heavyweight Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, have all placed billion-dollar, trillion-dollar bets on their countries to undertake a model of development that is beyond hydrocarbons. They still all rely on hydrocarbons, and therefore they all rely on the Strait of Hormuz. So that's one of the reasons why they sought a diplomatic solution ahead of hostilities, because I think everybody, with perhaps the exception of the President of the United States, understood that the Iranians would at least try to close the strait.
Do the Gulf states at this point have President Trump's ear, or is it just Bibi Netanyahu and his alliance with Israel?
I think there's been a lot of furious lobbying on the part of the Gulf leadership on the president. They all have direct lines to the president in one way or another. And they have made it clear now that the war is underway and now 5 weeks old, that even though they didn't want the conflict, they don't want the president to end it prematurely. Their feeling is that if Iran were to have some measure of control, if not outright control, of the Strait of Hormuz, if it still retained the ability to menace these countries with drones and missiles at will, it would undermine their model of development, which they have nurtured over the course of the better part of the last decade. And that model includes being open to the world, welcoming investment from around the world in high tech, logistics, entertainment, tourism, those kinds of things that have been sources of success and development beyond hydrocarbons would be at question if these countries are threatened by an even weakened Iran.
Did the Gulf states anticipate the level of effectiveness of the Iran attacks? Because they've been hit pretty badly. UAE has been. Saudi Arabia's been hit. Did they anticipate them being this effective?
I think that no one anticipated how effective the Iranian response would be. We know they're getting help from the Russians in terms of targeting, and I think that there was an expectation that the Iranians might respond, but that there would be a limit to their response. And after the first week or two, there was a sense that the rate of fire from the Iranians would decrease significantly, and they'd be able to get back to some sense of normalcy. That just has not happened, and I think that this is a very significant miscalculation on the part of the United States, on the part of Israel, and I think that the Gulf states, although very concerned about what would happen to their cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Manama, Riyadh even, and critical infrastructure in and around those countries, I think that they were worried about it, but didn't expect this relentless fire for 5 weeks and counting.
At some point, this will settle down or be resolved, however it's resolved. How much damage has already been done to the Gulf states? You mentioned before the billions, even trillions of dollars that they've been investing in making that a real center for investment, for tourism, for everything else. Has that been permanently damaged, do you think?
Well, the Gulf states have certainly taken a beating. Their air defense systems have worked better than some had expected, but still, the damage is undeniable. Gulf airspace has been open only at limited times and for limited purposes over the course of the last 5 weeks. And this entire model of development is based on attracting the best and brightest from around the world, attracting tech companies, providing entertainment venues for tourists, and the like. And I think at the moment, at least, that model has been significantly damaged. My sense is that when the crisis is over, there will be a deviation from this model so that the Gulf countries can harden their cities and invest in their defense and tighten, in some cases, their relationship with the United States in support of that. But then we'll return to this model of openness to the world so that people will come and invest and that they can proceed along some semblance of the path that they were on prior to the outbreak of hostilities on February 28th.
One of the foreign policy initiatives that President Trump has been proudest of are the Abraham Accords. He thought he should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize the first time around for what was done there. In light of what's happened, what's left of that initiative? Can it be revived?
Well, what's been surprising about the Abraham Accords is how actually durable they've been. Setting aside for just a moment the current conflict, through 2 years of very intense combat in the Gaza Strip in which tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed, the Abraham Accords survived. The core countries of the Abraham Accords have never broken diplomatic relations with Israel. And throughout this conflict, there has been some measure of coordination between Israel and countries in the Gulf, just by dint of the fact that they are all members of Central Command, the combatant command from which the United States secures the Middle East. So it is certainly a surprise that they've been durable through these last now almost 3 years of conflict throughout the Middle East. The big question prior to Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel was when Saudi Arabia and Israel would normalize. Now the question is if Saudi Arabia and Israel will normalize. And I think that as a result of both the conflict in the Gaza Strip and the sense among Saudi leaders that Israel has been an agent of chaos here, that the price of normalization between those two countries has gone up and is much further away than some would like to admit.
Coming up, we get ready for next week's World Bank IMF meetings in Washington with a guided tour from our